Okay, so what are we talking about today? Yes. What was the question I left you with on Wednesday? Yes, go ahead.
How did industrialization impact, and then you do a green arrow?
Yeah, that's exactly what I did. I'll do a blue if it's okay this time. How did it impact colonization? That is like a really critical question. And that's what we're going to answer today. But our example of this colonization isn't going to be just colonization generally. We're going to start with the Middle East. Now, we did this with China, and we're going to do it with the Middle East because you just can't not do it. In order to talk about the Middle East, I have to go back in time. So I'm going to start kind of from the beginning, very, very briefly, right up to 1500, and then up into our current era, which is what period? 1800 to right before World War I. If you read the material right before World War I think you should be able to handle this question. We'll see. If not, we'll just play it by ear. So I would put it up, let's just put 1915 here. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Now, just to keep in mind, to let you be alert, when we come back on Wednesday, I'm also going to answer this question, but I'm going to use a different example. What's the different example? India. Boom! Right on the ball. And in order to understand India, what also we have to do, we're going to have to do the same thing. A little bit, up to around 1500, to about 1900. We're going to spend a lot more time, though, on 1800s, because that's when we see colonization really in action in India. Just like for the Middle East, even though I'm going to go do this background, just keep in mind that the real action that we're going to see also is going to be in the 1800s. Can anyone take a wild guess, even before I start these lectures, to tell me why the real action is 1800? I'll give you a hint. It has a lot to do with the question that I put up top.
Industrialization?
Yeah, and when does that really begin? 1790s, which is about 1800. And so that's really when we're going to see the lifeblood of this colonization. I'm just going to warn you now, there are two types of colonization. Exploration colonization. And then the second time is empire colonization. I'm pretty sure we already introduced this, so I'm just going to ask you, you know what the difference is between these two?
The exploration is where you're kind of going out and seeing what's out there. You might set up a colony and stuff, but it doesn't necessarily benefit
mother country.
Yeah, mother country, whereas empire, it's all about what the mother country can do.
It's a very good explanation. I'm going to give you terms that will make it more clear. I think your explanation is really good. This is the term that's going to make it more clear. It's mercantilism. Prior to 1750s, there's not a lot of successful mercantilism. Mercantilism really begins in the late 1600s. I haven't explained it yet. I will. It begins in the late 1600s, but it's kind of being dabbled with. And it's being dabbled with by the Dutch, by the French, by the English, but it's dabbling. It's not until the mid to late 1700s that we see it really coming to fruition. And I'll tell you, it's largely because of this that the Americans have their revolution. Because the colonies are going to be treated differently. I'll give you one other hint here, just to kind of get your background. During this part of colonization, this was pre-mercantilism. And this is more of a legacy of feudalism. We talked about this before. During this era, at the very beginning, wealth was really equated with how much land you had, which is why Spain went off and took huge parcels of land. Now, in hindsight, we haven't spoken about this directly, but I think you get this. Does Spain benefit from these huge parcels of land? Temporarily, but no, they don't. What happened eventually, especially long term, what happened to all of them? They're gone. Okay? So this was not enduring, it wasn't successful. What happens in this era, wealth is not based off of land. What's it based off of? Trade, profit, right? Which is not unusual for us today. If I'm working at a bakery and they're not making a profit, how long am I going to be working there? Super easy. Not long, right? They have to be making a profit in order to be able to pay me. That's wealth. If it's not working. Now, in the Middle Ages, if I'm working for a bakery, how long do I work there? I mean, I'm working there, right? It's kind of it's not a duty, but often the bakery is probably owned by the local lord, and so you're giving a portion to the lord that allows you to be there. It's kind of like your rent. You may not see much money. It's different. Okay. That's why I do our daily quiz. I'm just going to give you a hint on the daily quiz. It has to do with geography. If you don't understand geography, especially world history, it's tough. But in this particular section, it's really important to understand what we're talking about. So I'm just going to give you a question, and while you do that, I'm just going to randomly doodle on the board. I do this math quite often, actually. How about this? I'm going to skip forward. It's cheating. Okay? I'm going to go into the 1900s, 20th century. I'm going to tell you about the fact that there were two guys here, Germany and Austria, right? And then there were some guys over here, France, England, and Belgium, okay, and Russia. Okay? And I'll say down here, there's another guy. There's a reason why I'm using these colors. But are they completely removed from Europe? No, they are involved with World War I. So of all these guys, who is most influenced by Western political tradition? Now, this does not mean that they would be considered the West. Today, the Ottomans don't have that name. What's the name of the old Ottoman Empire today?
Germany and the Turks.
Turkey. Okay, Turkey today. And is Turkey European?
No, it's the Middle East.
It's a really tough question. I don't know if you know much about modern Turkey. It's not European. It's not Middle Eastern. It is genuinely a combination of the two. You could say it'd be Europeanized. If you go to a Turkish city, a big Turkish city, it looks very European. You go outside of that city, it does not look European. Okay, you go off to Baghdad, it does not look European. Flat out, not going to be, right? But Turkey, it does. It's got a very strong European influence. Now you guys, the other question is, how do we see that influence? Rather than trying to look at the cause, we're looking at a symptom. How do we see that influence in modern Turkey that we don't see? Let me just make sure that you understand locations here. So Safavids, the Eastern Khanates. Why is Khan a familiar name to you guys? The Great Khan, right?
Chinese.
Genghis Khan, exactly, Chinese. Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan. The Khans, when the Mongols took over China, then their leaders were little Khans. Genghis Khan, Great Khan, Little Khan, okay? So the Eastern Khanates, where would that be? In the East, okay. Today, actually, their modern names would be like Uzbekistan. The northern realms up here, I'm going to use a different color here, around these guys, okay? Eastern Khanates. What about Mughals? India, that's exactly right. Okay, if you think of the, what is the pretty building? Taj Mahal. That would be a Mughal architecture. Okay. What about the Safavid? And this is where my map is sorely tested, because it's not really even there very well. It has to be stretched about that far, and then you'll see it. It's going to be what would be called modern-day Iran and Iraq. Okay. And where are the Ottomans? The Ottomans stretch over. Now, I'm going to tell you now where the Ottomans are in in theory, is not the same as where the Ottomans are in reality. That makes sense? And we'll explain why this is. What about over here, at one point before 1500, who had this area? You don't have to give a specific the Muslims. Who? The Muslims. And then who kicked them out in the late 1480s, right? It's called the Conquista. From 1400 basically up into 1460, they're slowly pushing out the Muslims, and what does that become? That becomes Spain. That's why Spain is different than the rest of Europe. Jews, in order to understand the Middle East, you must understand Islam. Okay, that makes sense? Okay, and I don't know how many of you actually understand Islam, like what its theories are. It's easy. I think in this class we've already talked about what the basic premise of Judaism is and the basic premise of Christianity, just like we found out what the basic premise of, well, we haven't really talked about Hinduism yet. We will on our Wednesday, but certainly we talked about Buddhism, right? And we talked about Taoism back when it was a religion, but you remember it didn't stay a religion all that time. And we talked about Confucianism, which was never a religion. It was always a philosophy, ethics, okay? And we can see Taoism kind of be in the middle because it kind of was in the middle for a while. Okay, well, we'll put that aside. So in order to understand China and Japan, you have to understand their religious views. In order to understand the Middle East, you must understand Islam. Okay, that makes sense?